everyone. Welcome to another episode of Leverage Your Podcast Show. And today we're going to cover not only the podcasting industry, but audience development. And that's something that really a lot of podcast hosts struggle with. So we are chatting with Robert Tuchman of Amazelab and Audience Lift. And welcome to the show.
Hey, Lindsay, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
No, I always love hearing everyone's story about how they got into the podcasting industry because obviously it's grown, but everyone has their own unique path. So yeah, what made you get into the industry?
It's interesting because I prior to starting Amaze Media Labs, I really and prior to hosting a podcast called How Success Happens for Entrepreneur, I was never involved in audio. I was an entrepreneur and I was in sports and entertainment and had created a few businesses there. And what happened was I had sold the last business and I was really looking for something to do. And I always loved growing up audio, sports radio for the most part. Even nowadays, I guess I'm getting older, like news talk. But in any case, I had a friend, a guy, Bill Shaw, who is the president over at Entrepreneur. And I went to Bill and said, I would love to do a podcast and create one that I could interview other entrepreneurs and I could, get their stories. Because from what I've seen is, you hear a lot of entrepreneurs and they'll talk and everyone thinks, the person who started Lululemon or the person who started Warby Parker, it was just super easy. They went from, and so in any case, Bill's like, hey, we have a show called How Success Happens. Why don't you just host this show instead of creating an entire new one? And I really thought he would think like I do 2 episodes and be like, this is too hard. And I'm up to like 300 episodes now and I love it. So that's how I got into it. And off of that, which I could talk about, is how I started a business in podcasting.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting to hear. Like some people will have just left their job and dive in. Some people do it on the side and it grows. Yeah. So dive into your story.
Yeah, sure. So what happened was I realized I would start, interviewing a lot of these entrepreneurs who were from big companies and they loved going on podcasts, getting on podcasts. And it just struck me. I was at the time, this was, right in like 2020, right when COVID was hitting. And I was like, why don't these companies have their own branded podcast? Why don't they have, their own narrative, show brand awareness, thought leadership? And I was very surprised how few they were. And even the ones that were out there were more like companies trying to create like cereal or like not actual like thought leadership. So I had the idea, went to my partner, this guy, Brett Sklar, who I worked on, or we created a couple business with in sports. And I said, I have this idea for a company. We should create branded podcasts for companies. And of course, I was just a host. I had no idea the production, the editing, everything that went into it. And long story short, we ended up starting it, and we have lots of big companies and Fortune 500 companies that use us for our production services. But the key thing I found out, which was the biggest struggle, and I understood this when you created these podcasts. Even my podcast, discoverability was so difficult. So we would do a podcast for like Ford Motor Company or, Amazon. And it was still hard to generate listenership. Like, you do a podcast and there'd be 200 listens and this company had a massive, presence. And that's what then took us into more of a technology to grow podcast as well, which is part of Amaze Media Labs, and it's called Audience Lift.
That's amazing. And it's true. It's like when you start a podcast, you don't realize all the tech and all the things that you have to do to produce it, but you also don't necessarily realize what it takes to grow the podcast. And now that it's such, a prominent strategy for many businesses, of course, the pool of businesses and the pool of podcasts has only just grown. But it is good to know that big brands like that also had that issue, because sometimes you feel like it's just the little guy, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. You do. Like, and people who are starting their own podcast might think, oh, I had 15 listeners because, I don't have enough people following me on social media, or I don't have, this huge network. But it really comes down to discoverability. And that's what really bothered us, or bothered me at the time, because there was such incredible content out there, whether it was individuals, who said, hey, can you listen to my show? Or whether it was companies producing, branded shows. And at the end of the day, you could have this incredible content, but, if it's not the Joe Rogan show, or Smartless, then it's so difficult to get discovered regardless. It's like everyone's waiting to go viral, and that just doesn't happen. So that's why we really created audiencelift.com, which is basically a tool or solution, where what we do is we promote your podcast trailer on we have our own DSP, so on these different websites. So let's say you have a podcast about the New York Jets. Unfortunately, I'm a New York Jets fan, so I've had a lot of misery. I know you're a Toronto Maple Leafs fan,
Yeah,
so
a lot of
you
crying.
you get it, you get the feeling. But what happens is, let's say I have this podcast on the Jets. What we do is we take that trailer and we insert it in our DSP, our websites like, ESPN.com or big sports sites, right? And we insert the podcast trailer next to contextually relevant content. So there's an article on the Jets, and all of a sudden the ad pops up for your podcast, or my podcast, which is about the Jets. Yours is about the Leafs, So, and basically what happens is we also can then target demographically who your listener, who you want listening. And what happens is that the person then listens to the trailer, and then on that trailer, they can subscribe. And this is the whole key and why this works really well. On the trailer, so they listen to it for like a minute, minute and a half, but on that trailer, they basically can subscribe. And it's not subscribing to the podcast.
Mhm.
What it is subscribing to receive push notifications about that podcast. And the difference is, I might be reading that article on the Jets, see this podcast, and be like, yeah, I want to listen to that. But, oh, you know what? It's 12:20. I've got lunch in 10 minutes. Forget it. And then I forget what the name of it was.
Yeah.
This way, you press subscribe and listen. And we found, at first I was like, who's going to do that? But we found that, 40% when we hit it right, contextually, would sign up to receive these push notifications. And then they would get the push notification 24 hours later, and they'd start listening to these podcasts. And if you look at some of the case studies on our website, from some of these podcasts, which are just general podcasts like me and you create, it doesn't have to be for thousands of new listeners, and you've built this kind of really engaged audience that you can continue to send push notifications to as new episodes come out.
I love that. And especially it's almost like they're bookmarking it, like remind me later about what I loved. That's really smart. And obviously push notifications, texting, it works. People are more likely to open and read and take action. So what a great strategy. That's very unique. I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, it really is the difference because I think what happens before, and I'm living proof of it with my own podcast, which is, done by entrepreneur, and they can send out, they do an article, they do everything. They have other ads. And, even I hate to say because I love this industry and that's why we created this. This is really was for the small podcaster. I mean,
Yeah.
like our audience lift starts at a few $100s you can to generate downloads and then it goes up because a lot of the huge players, use us from
Yeah.
Wondery to iHeart to Disney, but the little guys too. And the key is that it's really a discoverability tool, for everyone. And what I love about it is just the fact that, if you have good content, it just brings people to that content.
Yeah.
And then they could determine for themselves, hey, that was good. I want to go listen. And it really, again, because what I hated so much about this industry is so many good podcasts, so much good stuff out there. You just could never find it, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the difference maker with what this does. And it really works well. And I just, we want to just give everyone a chance
Yeah.
because we create good content and unfortunately no one could hear it because it just, it's you're not in the woods, right? The tree
Yeah.
falls.
Yeah, absolutely. You want more ears, you want more eyes, you want to impact more people. Absolutely. So when it comes to audience development and creating that discoverability, are there other things that podcasters can do to optimize their podcast so that it can be discovered more?
Well, for sure. I mean, the first thing is, when you do create your podcast and you create your show notes and, SEO still plays a factor
Mhm.
in discoverability, of course. That's really important. And then there's things, like that we've talked about, whether going on other podcasts, getting out there, really I think the key thing is consistency in showcasing clips on LinkedIn, on Instagram. Not that I don't believe people click off and then go. I know people don't click off and then go listen to your podcast, but you become a thought leader
Yeah.
and then they understand you have a podcast and then there's a time where they will go listen to it. So I do think doing all of those things, creating the content. I think the fact of just putting it out there, I think going on shows, that's all very helpful and part of it. But again, once we created Audience Lift and we had the ability where it was just like, hey, I'm reading about the same topic, and now
Yeah.
I see this podcast and I can subscribe and I can go to lunch and then, oh yeah, 24 hours later, let me check this out because I just got a push notification that has given us much more audience than anything that I've ever done, even with my own podcast. And I've had some incredible guests on, from Kevin Hart to Sarah Jessica Parker.
Wow.
And I would think, they put it on. I was like, oh, put it on your Instagram, put it on your Instagram.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unfortunately, it doesn't, as much as I would love for it to translate for people then downloading and listening to my podcast, I realized like it's very hard to move someone from a social media platform onto listening to a podcast. But what it does for me is it helps build my reputation as a thought leader, as an entrepreneur. So maybe some people say, hey, I'll listen to this guy's podcast.
Yeah.
He has some good guests.
Absolutely. And I find that many podcasters, when they launch a podcast, they're really stuck on, oh, I'm going to be on Spotify and I'm going to be on, I still call it iTunes, Apple. And then that's it. Um, and so, and some people don't realize that there are other directories or how to get on other directories. Can you touch upon that part?
Yeah, that's a great question. And really people just think, okay, I need to be on Apple and Spotify. And of course, 80% of the market, let's say when you are going and looking for podcasts and downloading them, come from, those two players. But there's 10 others that
Mhm.
have podcasts, or you can listen to podcasts on from iHeart to TuneIn to, I mean, you just can name tons of them. But I think in general, podcast is really changing. And what we wanted to do, and the thing with Audience Lift is, so what happens is when you see our trailer there, right? And you see the player, you click on it and you can subscribe, but then it takes you to a player, which is actually our player. So you can stay, let's say, on the website. If you're listening to my Jets podcast, you can stay on ESPN and start listening to episodes. Now, that's off of our own web
Mm.
player. And really, what this does, this is the difference maker, because there's only so many people who listen to podcasts regularly.
Yeah.
You always hear the stats, and I just don't even believe like the amount, although it is growing, which is great for our industry. But what we're doing too is that person that never listened to a podcast before, doesn't know what Apple or Spotify is,
Right.
but just read the article on the Jets and now is all of a sudden listening to a podcast. That opens up this whole new, arena of people who start listening to podcasts. So what I think is happening and what I've seen is even companies that are doing their own podcasts, individuals, they have microsites, there's YouTube channels, of course. It's no longer I have to listen on Apple or I have to listen on
Exactly.
Spotify. You could listen anywhere. It's audio. That's the
Yeah.
beauty of it, right? So I think what's really important at the end of the day isn't so much if your downloads are coming from or listens from Spotify or Apple, but it's your total
Mhm.
downloads. And whether it's our web player, whether it's your microsite, whatever your hosting platform is, which, if it's Simplecast or if it's Megaphone, it's going to show up regardless of where that person listened as a download. And that's what quantifies. You want more people listening. We want more people in the tent of listening to podcasts.
Yeah, 100%. And there's so many different options. And like you said, I honestly, even though I'm in the podcasting industry, I don't have a podcast app on my phone. I actually go to YouTube or I go to the person's website and actually listen within the person's website. It's just everyone is so different, right? So you kind of need to be everywhere and just make it as accessible as possible.
That's the key, Lindsay. I think really from what you just said is making it as accessible as possible, because it is, you're surprised because, having two teenagers and how quick they are with but a lot of people aren't
Yeah.
so technology and realizing, oh, I have to download this app. I find it on this app. It's shocking how many more people aren't actually. But and I am like not tech savvy at all. Although I do know how to use podcast apps. I
Yeah.
should, guess I'm in the business, but in any case, when you make it very easy, like with audiencelift.com, and you're reading that article, and all you have to do is click right there to subscribe, and then it takes you to a player, and I can start listening without having to go to Apple,
Right.
without having to go to Spotify. Like all of a sudden, I just became a podcast listener, and I'm counted as a podcast listener
Yeah.
because it doesn't matter, like you said, you just go to YouTube, you don't even have a player. And I think that's a huge change that's happening now. What it really is this audio on demand that now instead of going back to like my childhood where I would listen to sports radio, right? And I'd wait, I'd have to listen through the report on the Mets or the Yankees, and all I wanted to hear was the Jets. I'm going to lose so many people for you because I'm talking about the Jets so much here. But now you can go listen to like 10 podcasts that are just on what I want to listen to.
Yeah.
That's what I love about podcasts. And, I love the fact that it's no longer about I mean, I love radio. I grew up on radio, but I don't have to wait around.
Yeah.
And I just go and listen to what I want to listen to, the topics I want to listen to.
On demand. Absolutely. I was going to ask a question and it totally escaped me. Oh, yes. So if you're doing obviously you want to take action and develop your audience, get more discoverability. I'm assuming part of that is really understanding who your audience is. So how do you extract that information from your clients and really hone that in?
So basically how it works, what's great is that with Audience Lift and you can go to the site and play around with it. But what we do in terms of your target demographic, it's really kind of like if you looked at Apple where they have, okay, what category is this
Mhm.
podcast in? You can select several categories. So you might say, let's say I have a podcast on football. I can select sports and then I can select football. And then I can also select, hey, I know this podcast is more geared towards a certain, demographic, age demographic. So
Mhm.
there's different things that Audience Lift allows you to do that you put in the demographic that you want. And then really where the magic is in the technology we have, it's knowing what articles where those people are going to be, knowing what articles to place the podcast trailers from Audience Lift
Mhm.
in. And then it becomes smarter. Audience Lift becomes smarter. So it sees a lot of traffic coming from X or Y. And then it focuses in that area. It's like machine learning. I'd say it's AI. It's machine learning. And then you start realizing, and it gives you, and we give you, these are where your people are coming from.
Yeah.
This is where your target. I've learned so much from the podcast we've done because you think, oh, it might come from X, but it's coming from Y, and you don't know. Like, but the great thing about Audience Lift is that it really has the capability of showing you where your audience is coming from.
Oh, so you can actually almost get like an audience profile by running that data.
Exactly. So you can figure out who is my ideal audience because you
Right.
never, like right now, it's very hard. Like you can assume and you can guess who
Right.
your audience is, but at the end of the day, you never really, are 100% sure. And the beautiful thing about what we do is we can see, where we're driving the most traffic from, where people are listening from, how it's working. Does it work better, in on certain sites? It just gets smarter, and it's this is where AI comes into play and is a difference maker. How I see it in our business, it knows better than us, like where to place the ads. So
Right.
it's like
Right.
it's incredible. And instead of like when I go back and say, we did that first podcast for, Ford and it had 300 downloads. Now with Audience Lift and a $500 buy or less, there's thousands of downloads and they're,
Yeah.
real. Everything is monitored by Cloudflare, which, is the, pretty much premier authenticator in podcasting. Everything's IAB compliant. It's just really at the end of the day, it's advertising combined with AI, and it works extremely well.
That's
And
so
the
cool.
fact that you have push notifications where you can just basically, I don't have to listen to it this second, but they're gonna remind me tomorrow.
Yeah. Even to get them to take an action is like amazing. So I love the part about understanding and seeing the data of like where those people are taking action and taking interest. Because, like you said, you could think it's one type of person, but really the data shows you something different. Because don't you think that then you could take that to the rest of your marketing for your podcast? Or maybe you need to change the description of your podcast, or maybe you'd have to change the artwork then to attract more of those people. I think it allows you to optimize it in a bigger way.
Yeah, Lindsay, that's great. A great point. It's not just about, okay, just for Audience Lift and just for, this podcast per se, or this way of promoting it. What it really helps you understand is, other things and how you can promote. Just like you said, maybe I need to change the artwork because you know what, my demo's a little older, or maybe, I'm finding that, that people are finding us from X, Y, and Z, or I'm getting listenership here. Like maybe I need to, even change up episodes, and we have like, listen through rates, see where people dropped off or what. So, when you have that data and information, it doesn't just help you with our product. It really helps your overall marketing. And what like a lot of companies like to do is, they like to basically take that data and then apply it to their other paid media
Oh, yeah.
campaigns. It might not be. And we have another product, which is called the Branded Audience Growth Network. And it's different than Audience Lift in the way that it's much more targeted. Now, it's a little more expensive, but it's great for companies or individuals. So let's say you're a chiropractor and you really want to focus on people who just hurt their shoulder, right? Or whatever it might be. The Branded Audience Growth Network, we have the ability to be able to use keywords contextually to find those people that may have just hurt their shoulder in a certain zip code or geography. Or if you're, Ford Motor Company again, and you want to find people who are searching, looking to purchase, trucks, and you want to find those people again in a certain geography, or you are another company and you want to find just, people who work in marketing at a certain company. The Branded Audience Growth Network, which works the same way as Audience Lift, except it's much more detailed on the actual data and specifics. So it's a little more expensive because find that, to get zip codes and to get all that other information, it takes a lot more dollars to do that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, I didn't even think about that part where it's like if you're targeting in certain ads or even your, podcast sponsors, what have you, that data can just amplify your results and help you fast track your results and cut down that timeline of all that testing and money. It's like it would just make your marketing that much more effective quicker.
Which is true. And it's, the hardest thing. And that's why we really dove headfirst into this, because we were just shocked, or the team, that we would do these podcasts for companies with incredible social media assets and individuals, and realize that, we still weren't able to drive enough listenership. Now, there's different reasons companies do podcasts to create content, thought leadership. And, but the big part is at the end of the day, when you're looking at ROI, is how many people are listening.
Yeah.
And we were just shocked, that it really just came down to, you could have the greatest content, and again, it just came down to discoverability. And this has been the first tool that, we've created, both, the Branded Audience Growth Network, and of course our Audience Lift, formerly known as Trailergram, really were the two that just brought the most amount of listeners. But the beauty, like you said, is understanding and using that data to help you in all aspects. Because if you have a podcast and you are out there, you want to be hitting on all different areas, all different levels, not just one. Even if we have the means to put your podcast in the top 2 or 3%, still you want to be out there doing shows like we're doing. You want to be out there. You want to take your clips. You want to put them on your LinkedIn, on Instagram. You want to make sure that you are out there in any way possible to help you, because it helps you get guests. It helps you, drive listenership. It helps you become more of a thought leader. And I think, that's what's I've noticed is really important. But, one thing I'll say is just, that has been the biggest challenge I've come across, I think many of us in podcasting. And it's really a shame because again, I can't stress it enough. I know I've said it like 10 times, but there's so much good content And if it's just put in front of you, because that's content that our AI thinks you'll like, and
Yeah.
the AI is very smart, it's incredible how well it works. And then how you could just find these podcasts, and also just how it could just bring new people who never listened to a podcast, into the fold, and they're
Yeah.
listening to podcasts.
And come into your world in general and get to know you, get to know your business, and see if you're a solution for what their problem is. I think it's so cool how like AI and technology has just completely changed the game. Like, who would have thought even 5, 6 years ago that you could have AI that would help find the people for you? Like, it's kind of mind-blowing.
It's so mind-blowing. It's really incredible just from a standpoint, of what AI can do and how we use it. And, how I use it for Maze Media Labs, whether it's finding people who have podcasts, because we want to get to those
Yeah,
people to
yeah.
use Audience Lift, or whether it's finding people who potentially want to create a podcast, or, just whether it's helping rewrite, let's say, your show notes or things of that nature that really are so important. It's and not even it's like 2 years ago that
I
all of
know.
this, and we're all still, I love it because I'm still learning how to
Yeah.
use it, and things you can do, and new things are coming out, and it's scary in one end, but on the other end it's like fascinating, like
Yeah.
what it could do and how it could help you with any business, and especially with our business of podcasting. I think it's a game changer.
It absolutely is. And it sometimes feels like it's hard to keep up with, but at least there are experts out there that can just, in software and programs like Audio's Lift, that can just do it for you. That's what I
It's
love.
Yeah, because I'm not an engineer. I could never have built Audience Lift or figured it out or how they go about it. And there's other AI generated products and machine learning, and really that are super helpful. But I do think, with stuff that you can do, whether it's just
Mhm.
basic chat GPT, or, whatever it might be, what I'm diving into is just learning as much as I can on how to use
Yeah.
these technologies. But I've never seen, like, being in business 25 plus years, like I've never seen all of these new kind of tools and plugins that, are based off of AI that could really just help you. And it is overwhelming at times, and it's
Mhm.
hard because it's like,
General.
not being a tech person, like, you really have to jump in and then learn it and understand it, or rely on experts, and,
Yeah.
or test things. But it is pretty amazing what's going on in the space. And I think, it's not just with podcasting, although that's what we're talking about. It's really with every industry right now, which is, as I said, exciting and scary at the same time. And as I tell my children, it's like, learn as much about AI as possible, and tools and whatever it is, like that is definitely the future and where
Yeah.
things are going. And it's going to be incredible, and how fast it's moving. It's just really amazing.
Yeah. It is cool. And we thought fax machines were cool back in the day.
We used to have in my first business a fax. So we would send an agreement. And the first business we created, events for companies. If you wanted to go to the Super Bowl or the Stanley Cup,
Mhm.
we had these packages, right? And this was back in the late 90s. I remember, this is how old I am. We had one email for the company, and then we would send a contract, and we would send out the contract it would come back via fax. So
Yeah.
whenever the fax machine, for those who remember, would ring and we knew
Yes.
something was coming through, all the sales guys and girls would jump
Yeah.
up and like be like, is that my contract? Is that my
Yeah.
agreement?
Yeah.
And it's funny, I forget where I was. Maybe we're renting an Airbnb and there was like a fax machine and like my kids had no
No,
idea. And it
no.
was just so nostalgic, like just
I know.
seeing.
I can hear that screechy like
Yeah,
dial-up ring right
yeah.
now.
It's it's totally like the old America, AOL, right?
Yes.
Like when you're getting on the internet
Oh
and like
God.
with that fax machine, that little buzz was,
Reach.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's really incredible. And
Yeah.
and when you think about it, it wasn't that long ago,
It
right? It
wasn't.
wasn't
We're
that
not
long
80
ago.
or anything yet. Like we're still
No,
young.
no, can you imagine like the stuff they're gonna have like come 10 years
Oh my
from now?
God. I don't even want to think about that yet.
I'm gonna just try and keep
Keep
learning
up.
and
Yep.
trying figuring it out. But hopefully, as long as it's interesting, which it
Yeah.
really is. So we'll see.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. I've loved this conversation. I think Audio Lift is like the coolest thing since sliced bread to be able to use AI and technology to help solve a huge problem for podcasters. Kudos to you. Well done.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And it's really kudos to our engineers and our team that really created Audience Lift and, using Audience Lift. And what we really wanted is those, even though it's being used a lot, as I mentioned, by bigger companies because it works so well, it's really about the small podcaster that can utilize this at a very
Mhm.
low price point, less than it cost you to do, whether it's, Google AdWords or paid media, and
Oh
it
God, yeah.
works so well. And that's who it's really for, because as we talked about, I think before we came on, as a podcaster, it's really disheartening when you do a show and you have like 20 listeners, and then people do three shows, and then they're like, you know what? I'm out. Like,
Right?
it's, and you could have the most incredible content,
I
and you could have a
know.
show that's better than Joe Rogan, better than whatever it might be. But again, it's back to that analogy of, or whatever you call it, of the tree that falls in the forest.
Yes.
And that's what we're trying to do, is just make as many people aware for as cheap as possible
Yeah.
for people, so then their podcast can gain traction. And as I said, if you want to check it out, you can go to audiencelift.com and play around with it. We have a video tour, and it will show you, how it's done, who's using it, and it's pretty incredible. It's helped me, it's helped my podcast.
Mhm.
And it's really amazing. You only need, from what I was reading, a couple thousand downloads, which can seem like a lot, but we're able to deliver. And all of a sudden, you're in I think according to Buzzsprout, you're in like the top 5% of all podcasts
Sweet.
globally.
Yeah. Isn't that
So,
crazy?
I mean, it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So anyway, I really appreciate you giving me the time to come on, and I love talking about the industry, and what
Yeah.
you're doing is really incredible, and helping podcasters from what you do with them in terms of, helping them and their social media, their clips, how to create show notes that work. And when I say use AI, you have to really know first how to write them. Then you can
Yes.
use the AI to help you cut down or whatever. But like there's certain tricks and techniques and ways to build people's audience, or if they go on a podcast like you do and they want to get out there, it's the best way to show thought leadership. And that's why I love creating podcasts for brands and companies, and just trying to tell, at the end of the day, interesting stories that you never get from, a news clip or just reading
No.
two lines on someone saying something. It's all
Yeah.
about the stories and the conversations, which is awesome.
Yeah. Honest, authentic conversations that are not um censored.
No, no, they're real and it's empathetic, and people, it's the best. When I do, I love in How Success Happens, and I'm creating a new podcast now, which is going to be innovators in business,
Ooh.
and we're actually called Business Innovators, which will launch in the fall. And really, the premise is I want to take everyone's the hardest moment they had, because every single person I've interviewed from How Success Happens, no matter how big their company is today, and lots of billion-dollar businesses, they all had that moment where they were going to quit. They had
Oh,
to pick
100%.
themselves up from that. Right. And you don't, what I love
No one
about it
talks
is
about it.
that you just hear Lululemon or you hear Patron and you think it was always just,
Yeah,
like
easy.
everyone loved it.
Yep.
Right. And what I love about what I'm going to do with, business innovators is the fact that just tell me about that moment where you were about to give up, or what changed, or how did you pivot. And I think that's really important, especially your listeners who have podcasts, like understanding that, as you learn and as you change, you have to do different things, and something, you will be able to get it out there. And there's things, whether it's audiencelift.com or other techniques, or utilizing services like people
Yeah.
like yourself, that are going to help those people and hopefully get them to the next level. But no one has an easy story, is what
No,
I've learned.
no, they don't.
And that's
But we
just
wouldn't have
business.
it any other way, would we, Robert?
Well, thanks for having me. I
Yeah.
really
Thank
appreciate it.
you.
Yeah, you got it.
Perfect. Well, I hope you got a ton of information from this episode and some great tips. And obviously, you've gotten some amazing tools to use. So until next week, I will see you on the Leverage Your Podcast show. Take care.